We've changed venue on you because we want to change your perspective a little bit. So we've heard a lot about this morning the American strategic perspective and several interpretations about what went on in the war from the American perspective. But what about the other major belligerents? The ones who really mattered because it was their country. And specifically, I'm talking about the South and North Vietnamese. Now, why did North Vietnam win and achieve victory of its political goals, and why did the South fail? That's what this panel will discuss today, to give us some perspectives from the other side and to sort of change the narrative and look through it through their eyes. Our first panelist is Dr. Andrew Wiest, University Distinguished Professor of History and founding director of the Dale Center for the Study of War and Society at the University of Southern Mississippi. Specializing in the study of World War I and Vietnam, he has served as a visiting senior lecturer at the Royal Military Academy at Sandhurst and as a visiting professor in the Department of Warfighting Strategy at the Air War College. He is the author of several books on the Vietnam War, including Vietnam's Forgotten War, Heroism and Betrayal of the ARVN. Today, he'll address aspects of the South Vietnamese war effort. Ladies and gentlemen, please welcome Dr. Andrew Wiest.
I'd like to thank everybody here at VMI, especially General P, Colonel Gray, and Major Connolly. And Major Connolly received far too many emails from me, so I certainly made Major Connolly work pretty hard to get me here. A full understanding of the Vietnam War simply has to come to grips with the wartime role played by the Republic of Vietnam Armed Forces, usually referred to by the more restrictive name of the Army of the Republic of Vietnam, or ARVN. While most of the first generations of histories of the war either chose to write off ARVN and the state it served as bumbling and doomed to failure, it can be argued that ARVN, and we heard this a little bit earlier, was the most critical player in the Vietnam War. And American victory in the war was only possible if ARVN learned to translate battlefield success into strategic sustainability. Given the historically dim view of ARVN's capabilities, it's easy to jump to the conclusion that their war was hopeless, and that the United States had simply backed the wrong Vietnamese. But the case is far from being this simple. Narrating ARVN's complex history is far too vast a topic for today, so I plan on limiting myself to a couple major points. What was ARVN and why? What were some of its kinetic abilities in both the pacification and the big unit war? So first to what was ARVN? History matters in Vietnam, and the land where the nation's glorious martial past is learned by every schoolchild and where families revere their long-departed ancestors. Both the Republic of Vietnam, South Vietnam, and the Democratic Republic of Vietnam, North Vietnam, did their very best to tie their causes directly to Vietnam's storied history, a task that was much easier, frankly, for the communists. While brutal and often divisive, Ho Chi Minh and the Viet Minh could claim legacy as victorious freedom fighters, both against the Japanese and then later the French. ARVN, though, was saddled with the societal albatross of being a direct descendant of French colonial forces in Vietnam. During their colonial heyday, the French had created indigenous units to serve alongside their own military in Vietnam. Reeling from World War II and facing the rise of the Viet Minh, the French altered their ruling structure in Vietnam in 1950, beginning the process of helping to raise and train the Vietnamese National Army, or VNA, to serve the newly independent Vietnam ruled by Emperor Bao Dai. A draft call went out to fill the ranks of the new army, but most of the VNA's officers and men were initially drawn from volunteerism and from the indigenous colonial units. Little has been written on the fascinating history of Vienna, which served a hybrid colonial state, as France was arguably looking to wind down its empire and its Vietnamese colony. The VNA was only arguably just hitting its military stride by the time of the French defeat at Dien Bien Phu in 1954, having expanded to a force of over 200,000 men. By that stage in the conflict, the VNA was much more reliant on a draft, and since it mainly fought alongside the French, had only a rudimentary general staff, no artillery, no heavy armor, no logistic capability of its own, and a few Vietnamese officers above the rank of lieutenant. At the close of the First Indochina War, some VNA members simply went home. Many defected to the Viet Minh. For many others, though, especially those who had been trained at the Vietnamese National Military Academy at Dalat, and the enlisted men raised after the waning of French power, a true sense of Vietnamese nationalism, a non-communist nationalism, remained. Especially early in the new war, ARVN had a real chance to seize the mantle of being a nationalist, non-communist alternative to the Viet Minh. From the Catholic minority to believers in democracy, to student activists, to Buddhist monks, to Cao Dai adherents, to newspaper editors, there was a wealth of potential support for a non-communist answer to Vietnam's problems of independence and unity. In those early years of the Vietnam War, South Vietnam fought a lower level form of warfare, one that was arguably more locally sustainable given the country's agrarian wet rice agricultural economy. In 1960, ARVN numbered only 150,000 troops, fewer than the total that had once served in the VNA. There was compulsory military service for those men ages 20 to 22, who owed the nation an 18-month commitment. Roughly half of the soldiers in this first stage of ARVN were volunteers, and their military commitment was still, as yet, well within the societal realities of a country made up of 18 million inhabitants. As the Vietnam War intensified, though, its appetite for bodies, American, Vietnamese, Korean, Australian bodies, Thai bodies, you name it, grew by leaps and bounds. By 1963, ARVN had grown to 250,000 men. By 1969, it had mushroomed to over 800,000 men, with all males between age 16 and 50 called up for military service, with some owing a 7-year commitment in the military. The results were frankly devastating to the South Vietnamese society and economy. As the war sputtered on with no end in sight, there's little wonder that volunteerism could do little to keep up with ARVN's appetite for new recruits. The result was an ever more draconian draft system, one that preyed especially on rural laborers, and one that resulted in one of the most heavily drafted armies in modern history. It was a staggering effort, with one U.S. official reporting that if the United States had mobilized a similar proportion of its adult male population, that we would have sent 8 million men a year to Vietnam. Maintaining ARVN morale for the long haul of the Vietnam War in the face of these many challenges required a unifying ideology and a positive call to arms to fight for a South Vietnamese state that was worthy of sacrifice. That the government of the Republic of Vietnam and ARVN failed in this regard is perhaps the deciding factor in the war. As the government at Saigon provided little leadership lurching from crisis to crisis and with no workable solution emanating from Washington or MACV, those within ARVN realized early on that the problems of motivation of the troops and perception were deadly serious. The two rising stars of ARVN, around whom much of my research is based, Pham Van Dien and Tran Ngoc Way, realized very early as young officers that ARVN had to do a very credible job of training its people about the evils of communism and the righteousness of its own cause. That task had to begin with the soldiers who made up the rank and file of ARVN. These men would defend the state of South Vietnam and function as the most compelling image of that state. However, since the Saigon government lived in constant fear of a military coup, nationalism and patriotism played only an insignificant role in ARVN training. In the words of ARVN enlisted man Nguyen Van Chow, most soldiers that I knew understood little about why we were fighting. Not once did any of my instructors mention a proactive political agenda. When he was drafted, enlisted man Dan Nguyen remarked, I followed orders and went blindly, but didn't know why I went. We had to go because war came. That was it. No one questioned it. No one thought about the reason why we were asked to go. While the communists concentrated much of their efforts into indoctrinating their soldiers regarding the need of why they fought, ARVN concentrated its efforts on the mechanics of training. Every ARVN expatriate officer and enlisted man I've ever interviewed has mentioned this lack of indoctrination and a unifying political will as being key to ARVN's dismal eventual fate. Former ARVN intelligence analyst Cal Van Tu recalled, the communists did an excellent job in ideological training, even if the party's message was pure propaganda. In South Vietnam, we did nothing to prepare the countryside for the needed sacrifice. By 1974, there were 1.1 million men serving in the South Vietnamese military. Lieutenant General Dong Van Quyen recalled that, quote, South Vietnam had scraped to the bottom of its manpower resources. Every household, therefore, had at least one member in military service. Without a unifying ideology, a positive motivator for the fight, that phenomenal level of sacrifice was untenable in the service of a war that dragged on for South Vietnam for nearly 20 years. Even the United States tired of its conflict with far less time and far less cost. One of ARVN's most important roles was developing American war in Vietnam at the local level and the struggle for the hearts and minds of the people that we heard about earlier today. Territorial forces, locally raised units who were part of the people and intimately familiar with the area, were perhaps the most obvious solution to meaningful rural security. The South Vietnamese had founded the Civil Guard and the Self-Defense Corps, groupings of paramilitary forces, in 1955, initially tasking them with internal security duties, while ARVN itself focused on stabilizing the new state. The South Vietnamese supported the creation of these local forces in the hopes that they would play a significant counterinsurgent role alongside of ARVN in the main unit war. The idea, though, was largely stillborn, with the U.S. leaving the territorial forces of the military out of the military assistance program. It was not until 1964, long after the Viet Cong insurgency was well underway, that the territorial forces were integrated into the ARVN command structure, becoming known as the regional forces and the popular forces. In their new incarnation, RFPF assumed their roles as defenders of provinces, districts, villages, and hamlets across South Vietnam. Only recently reclaimed from the military scrap heap, the RFPF suffered from a nearly complete lack of training. In units often made up of luckless draft evaders and deserters who got caught up in police sweeps, those with military experience were left to instruct those without in difficult, quote-unquote, on-the-job training. Making matters worse, the RFPF carried outdated weaponry, only receiving U.S. armament of World War II vintage, including the M1 carbine, after 1960. At the same time, the Viet Cong units were receiving the AK-47s and RPG-7s, seriously outclassing the organic firepower of RFPF, which also received the lowest class of organic firepower support of all kinds and could not normally call on the massive U.S. ARVN preponderance in artillery and air power to tip the balance of battle into their favor. A study of 3 Corps in 1967 revealed a disturbing reality that in 234 RFPF friendly initiated actions in which calls went out for fire support, in nearly 200 cases, no support was forthcoming. In 1967, Pham Van Dien took over as district chief of Quang Dien district just outside of Hue, a very important rice-growing district in central Vietnam. The district contained a population of about 46,000 people, scattered in 8 main villages and a collection of scattered subsidiary hamlets. As was all too often in South Vietnam, Dinh found that 2 territorial companies in the district and all of the territorial platoons, each fielded by each village, were in disarray, leaving the Viet Cong dominant in half the villages and hamlets of the district and in control of pretty much all the area's rice farming resources. The situation was so bad that Dinh had to stand down his territorial units and start over. And this is in 1967. Local studies of ARVN units across the country indicate that what Dinh found in Quang Dien district was far from an isolated incident. This was par for the course for RFPF units as late as 1967. When the American War began to change post-Tet in 68, we began to really put crash courses for the RF and PF into place. But it simply couldn't overcome over a decade of negligence for these units. For all their faults and foibles, the RFPF actually fought very hard in the Vietnam War. In the period 68 to 72, when some of the most intense fighting in the war took place, RFPF losses in those years totaled 69,291 dead. That compares to ARVN's losses in those same years of 36,932 dead. And American losses in those years was 30,005 dead. Given their military lot in life, it's actually amazing that RFPF fought as hard as they did, as long as they did. Even poorly trained, even poorly armed, even at the bottom of the logistics chain, the RFPF fought on, indicating the local strength of support for the Republic of Vietnam and a non-communist nationalism that's often missed in the bigger picture. Leaving the territorial forces relegated to the sidelines for so long ultimately crippled the war efforts of both ARVN and the U.S. military in the Vietnam War, a mistake that was rectified far too late and that helped to doom both the American war effort and South Vietnam to defeat. In terms of the big unit war, after 1965, ARVN served largely as an adjunct to its mighty American ally. In the main, ARVN units, field units, were relegated to a second level of warfare. U.S. units were first tasked with driving enemy forces out of an area, then ARVN was tasked with not allowing them back. Relying on the primacy of U.S. provided fire support, in this period ARVN won pretty much all of its battles. Certainly the vast majority in this secondary role, but many of ARVN's best commanders chafed at their lot in military life and wondered aloud if ARVN was being used to the best of its abilities. On one hand, the ARVN military staffs had little chance to learn their operational craft at anything above a company or perhaps battalion level. They were not in on the strategic planning for these big operations. On the other hand, at the highest political military echelons, where ARVN badly needed systemic reform, there was no urgency whatsoever. Why did ARVN, or the state that it served, need to go through the painful processes of reform when the U.S. would always step in and save it from its own destruction? There grew in ARVN, especially at its top politicized levels, at its pinnacle, a decided tendency to, quote, let the Americans do it all. This reliance on the Americans and their magic firepower proved stifling. General No Quang Trung, perhaps ARVN's most gifted combat commander, commented, the powerful U.S. tactical and artillery firepower provided ARVN combat units with most effective and accurate support and assisted them in winning several major battles. Vietnamese commanders and troops alike were entirely confident of this support's effectiveness. The lavish use of firepower, however, became ingrained in Vietnamese tactics and became a very bad habit. Whenever contact was made with the enemy, regardless of size or firepower, ARVN units invariably stopped in place and requested all-out firepower support by artillery and tactical air. Even though their efforts were very well intentioned, the U.S. advisors on the scene who served with ARVN units became part of this institutional problem. The U.S. advisor's chief role was to serve as a conduit to American firepower. When locked in battle, ARVN officers turned to their advisors to request, plot, and deliver firepower that usually proved decisive. The relationship between U.S. and ARVN counterparts was often tactically very productive, but at a steep institutional price. General Cao Van Ven remarked, gradually, the ARVN commander's passivity made him excessively reliant and sometimes totally dependent on his advisor. The end result was that the commander's initiative, sense of responsibility, and personal authority became seriously affected in the long run, and the advisor's presence had the undesirable effect of reducing his counterpart's chances for asserting and developing his own command and leadership abilities. After the American withdrawal from Vietnam began in the wake of the Tet Offensive, there were real efforts on the part of MACV and the advisors all over the country to help ARVN come of age and wean it from its reliance on U.S. firepower. However, just as in the case of the RFPF, after so many years of fighting as an adjunct alongside its superpower partner, ARVN's problems were so ingrained as to frustrate quick fixes. Been talking about some pretty general stuff. I now want to use one battle as an example, and this is the invasion of Laos in 1971, the Lam Son 719 invasion of Laos. Perhaps it was this invasion that best represents the strengths and weaknesses of the ARVN of the American war period in Vietnam. National furor in the home front after the 1970 invasion of Cambodia meant that ARVN had to operate in Laos without its American advisors, without its conduit to American firepower support. Making matters worse, ARVN plans for the invasion of Laos rested on something of a best-case scenario. The previous year, the NVA had run away pretty quickly during the invasion of Cambodia, and to put it frankly, ARVN was banking on them doing that again in Laos in 1971, and that was not going to come to fruition. The ARVN force of 17,000 men that invaded Laos eventually squared off against a force of about 60,000 NVA regulars. Pretty much every military force the NVA could muster was thrown into the Laotian, defending against the Laotian invasion. Essentially what happened is ARVN wanted to drive into Laos down the one road in the area, so that's pretty easy to predict where ARVN's going to go. They were trying to get to an NVA base area called the city of Chapon. Wasn't much of a city, but it was pretty much the Walmart of the Ho Chi Minh Trail. It was a huge logistics hub. The problem was there was a road with an escarpment on both sides. There was hills to the north and hills to the south. So the main idea was to run tanks down that road, an armored column, and along the north side, Rangers and airborne troops would seize hilltops and use those as fire bases to offer flank support. And south of the road, the ARVN 1st Division would chopper into another series of hilltop redoubts and use those as fire support bases to guard the troops that are heading down the road. For the first 3 or 4 days it went well, and you might expect why. The North Vietnamese were really aware this was coming and setting a very elaborate trap. Within 4 days, the attack had bogged down, and the North Vietnamese are massing against and overthrowing the Ranger and airborne bases to the north of the road. And in one of the more unfortunate incidents in this war, the ARVN tanks that are on the road disobey orders and don't go help their brethren who are on these hills, and in fact spectate the battle and watch them get destroyed, leading to some of the more important media images from this war. The only way out of those fire bases was on helicopters, and every ARVN soldier who could get on did. So they rode home back to Khe Sanh on skids, and it made for a media frenzy. Doubling down on the problem, General Lam and President Thieu, who kind of understood that the whole thing had gone to pot, but understood too that South Vietnam's credibility was on the line, they decided for a lightning strike onto Chapon itself. And in the biggest airborne landing of the war, took 2 entire South Vietnamese battalions and airlifted them onto Chapon. And for a couple days, they were doing some pretty important stuff around Chapon, but that meant they now had to fight their way out, right straight through 60,000 NVA soldiers who stood in their way. And one of the guys I researched, I was hoping he was going to be here today, Tran Ngoc Quay. His unit that had gone into Laos, he was one of the units, landed at Chapon. He and his 400 men had to fight their way out. 26 of them made it. The rest of them, including Hue, were either killed or, in his case, served 13 years in North Vietnamese prisons. The media feasted on this and showed it as a horrible South Vietnamese defeat. President Nixon trumpeted this as a wonderful South Vietnamese victory, and of course it's actually somewhere in the middle. Even with its failures in leadership, though, what Lam Son 719 shows us is that ARVN could actually, even at this late stage in the war when it's thrown fully into the big unit war, can do some pretty big stuff. It invaded enemy-held territory outside the country, working as a corps for the very first time, and many of its officers and men fought very bravely. Of course, at the very top, some of them were totally corrupt and disobeying orders, and you name it. It's exactly what the ARVN should be at this time, given what we've created it to be. And then finally, what to make of ARVN. On one hand, ARVN was born from the wreckage of French colonialism, which seemed to place it in a nearly fatal disadvantage when pitted against its communist foes. And yet, ARVN was able to command the loyalty and sacrifice of a sizable chunk of the South Vietnamese population, demonstrating a linkage to a non-communist form of Vietnamese nationalism. On one hand, ARVN had only partly understood its own war of pacification, leaving territorial units poorly trained, poorly motivated, and badly undergunned. And yet, RFPF forces had fought long and hard, absorbing heavy losses and dealing out considerable damage to their communist foes. For all of its many problems, ARVN's reach into South Vietnam's localities through the RFPF was profound. On one hand, ARVN was arguably built for the wrong war, shunted aside by its American allies and vastly over-reliant on the primacy of U.S. firepower, problems that were on full display in the invasion of Laos in 1971. And yet, ARVN achieved considerable battlefield victories through its brief history, and even the Laotian debacle was peppered with reminders of what ARVN could be and might become. That ARVN comprehensively failed in 1975 is beyond doubt. That ARVN labored throughout the conflict under the heavy weight of crippling disadvantages is also beyond doubt. That ARVN sparked loyalty from so many and fought for so long and paid such a heavy price, though, indicates there was something there with which to work. ARVN had potential, perhaps potential enough to have won its war under different circumstances. Thank you.
Go sit over there.